مرگ بر آمریکا، مرگ بر آمریکا، مرگ بر آمریکا، مرگ بر آمریکا.
If you have been hearing Muhammad Baqir Ghalibaf's name more often lately, that is not an accident. In the Islamic Republic, when things are stable, power usually hides behind institutions, titles, and slogans. But when the system is shaken, when war hits, when top figures are removed, and when the fight becomes about survival, the real faces of power start stepping out of the shadows. And one of those faces is Muhammad Baqir Ghalibaf. For some people, he is just a speaker of the parliament. For others, he is the former mayor of Tehran. And for some, he is simply another conservative politician inside the system. But that's not the real picture. Ghalibaf is not just a politician. He is one of the clearest products of the Islamic Republic itself. A man who came out of war, the IRGC, repression, policing, patronage, city government, parliament, and the inner circles of power, and who has spent years moving closer and closer to the center of the regime. And now that Khamenei is dead, and the structure of the regime has been badly shaken, Ghalibaf is back in a central role. He is no longer sitting in the background. He is out front again. This video is not a dry biography. This is a case file. Who is he really? Where did he come from? What role did he play in repressing Iranians? How did he climb through the system? How close was he to Ali Khamenei? And why do so many people have reason to believe that he sees this moment as his chance to move even closer to the top? Because if you want to understand how the Islamic Republic survives, you need to understand men like Ghalibaf. And if you want to understand how dangerous the next phase could be, you need to understand what kind of man he really is. One of the biggest mistakes people make when talking about Ghalibaf is treating him like a normal politician. He's not. He was never an outsider. He was never a reformer. He was never some independent manager who later entered politics. He is a man of the system from the beginning. He rose through the Iran-Iraq war generation, moved up through the Revolutionary Guards, became commander of the IRGC Air Force, later became Iran's national police chief, then mayor of Tehran, and eventually speaker of the parliament. That career path tells you almost everything you need to know. This is not the path of civilian statesman. This is the path of a security state insider. And that matters, because behind Ghalibaf's political image is the mind of a man shaped by command, force, discipline, loyalty to the system, and logic of control. Some people are violent but clumsy. Some are political but weak. Ghalibaf is more dangerous than that. He is the kind of man who understands force, understands power, understands institutions, understands image, and understands survival. For years, he has tried to sell himself as a man of action. But the real question is, man of action for what? For the people or the survival of the regime? That is the question that hangs over his entire career. If you really want to understand Ghalibaf, you have to go back to where the masks were thinner, repression. One of the most important chapters in his record is the 1999 student protest. This was one of the key moments in post-revolution Iran when the regime showed how brutally it would respond to dissent. Students were attacked, beaten, arrested, and in some cases disappeared into the machinery of the state. Ghalibaf is tied to that word of repression. What matters here is not just that his name appears around that period. What matters is what kind of role he played in the Islamic Republic during moments like that. He was not a man standing against the crackdown. He was part of the order that made crackdowns possible. And what makes this even more important is that years later, an audio recording emerged in which he openly spoke about personally going into the streets and confronting protesters.
افرادی که تو جلسه شورای امنیت کشور، نه شورای امنیت ملی، تو وزارت کشور نشسته بودیم، من تو اون جلسه محکم دعوا کردم، حرفای بسیار تندی زدم، نمیخوام اینجا بزنم، یعنی اونجا من اصلا شأن جلسه رعایت نکردم و گفتم امشب هر کی بیاد تو کوی بخواد این کارا رو انجام بده، من غالباف عنوان فرمانده ناجا محکم میشتم لولش میکنم و جمعش میکنم محکم، به حدی که من یه حرف بی‌ادبانه تو جلسه زدم و بلند شدم توی اون جلسه با برخوردی که انجام دادم مجوز حضور نظامی و تیراندازی برای ناجا در کوی دانشگاه در سال 82 از شورای امنیت کشور آقای لاری، آقای معین، اونا پاش امضا کردن به من دادن و گفتم امشب هر کی بیاد تو کوی بخواد این کارا رو انجام بده، من غالیباف به عنوان فرمانده ناجا محکم میشتم رولش میکنم و جمعش میکنم.
That matters because it strips away the later image making. It shows that beneath the polished language and the political career was the still same man shaped by the security mentality of the Islamic Republic. This is the part that should never be forgotten. Today, some people may try to frame him as a serious statesman, a practical negotiator, a disciplined manager, or even a stabilizing figure. There are people in the Islamic Republic who are merely corrupt. There are others who are merely incompetent. Ghalibaf belongs to a category that is more dangerous. Men who helped build and operate the machine of repression and never truly broke from it. That is not some minor footnote in his biography. That is one of the central truths of who he is. Ghalibaf did not rise this high on ambition alone. He rose because he was useful to the core of the system, and he rose because he was close to the center of power. His career makes that obvious. In the Islamic Republic, people do not move from the IRGC to National Police Chief to Tehran Mayor to Parliament Speaker unless the system trusts them. That kind of career does not happen by accident. It does not happen just because someone is competent. It happens because the power structure sees them as reliable. And Ghalibaf was reliable in exactly the way Islamic Republic values most. Loyal to the system, proven in hard moments, rooted in security apparatus, and politically flexible enough to move across different institutions without threatening the system itself. That is why his rise matters. He was not floating around the edges of power. He was inside it. He belonged to the type of figure the regime keeps close for difficult times. Men with revolutionary credentials, security backgrounds, common experience, and enough ambition to keep climbing, but not enough independence to become true outsiders. That is why his closeness to Khamenei matters so much, because it means Ghalibaf was not just another official under the system. He was part of the trusted inner class that made the system function. Ghalibaf is not just a man associated with repression. He is also a man associated with corruption and patronage networks that define the Islamic Republic. This is where his years as mayor of Tehran become especially important. He was not just running a city. He was sitting on top of massive budgets, land deals, construction networks, development projects, patronage systems, and access to enormous financial power. And in the Islamic Republic, where there is vast money, weak accountability, inner circle access, and political protection, corruption is never far behind. That is exactly the atmosphere that followed Ghalibaf's image. For years, allegations, scandals, and accusations of corruption shadowed him and his allies. Even when his defenders tried to frame him as a manager of technocrats, the smell of corruption never really left. And that matters because it completes the picture. Ghalibaf is not just a hard man of the security state. He is also one of those Islamic Republic survivors who seems to have benefited from both sides of power, the feast and the table. He comes from the world of force, but he also learned how to sit at the table of money, patronage, and influence. And that combination is one of the ugliest features of the system. Because when a man is tied to both repression and corruption, you are no longer looking at someone who merely serves power. You are looking at someone who has learned how to extract from it. One of the most important things to understand about Ghalibaf is this: he has always wanted more. This is not a man who was content with being a military commander, or a police chief, or a mayor, or even a speaker of the parliament. He has tried repeatedly to move higher. He ran for president several times. He kept returning, he kept repositioning, he kept trying to present himself as the serious man, the practical man, the disciplined man, the man who could run the country. That pattern matters because it shows that Ghalibaf's ambition is not temporary. It is structural. It is part of his political DNA. Some people fail once and retreat. Ghalibaf is not like that. He reinvents the costume and comes back again. First as a commander, then as a police figure, then as a city manager, then as a presidential contender, then as a parliamentary leader, and now, in one of the most fragile and uncertain moments in the history of the Islamic Republic, he is once more again positioned close to the center. That is not random, and this is where analysis becomes unavoidable. My reading is simple. Ghalibaf looks like a man who has spent years preparing himself for exactly this kind of moment. A moment when the top of the pyramid is weakened, when major figures are gone, when the regime needs someone who is brutal enough to protect the system, political enough to negotiate, experienced enough to be taken seriously, and ambitious enough to grab the opportunity. And Ghalibaf seems to see himself as exactly that man. That is analysis, not proven inner motive. But when you put this record together, it is not a far-fetched reading at all. One of the most revealing things about Ghalibaf is the contradiction he embodies. On one side, he is part of the political theater of the Islamic Republic, the slogans, the performances, the stage defiance, the ritual hostility. You see it in the parliament, you see it in the chants, you see it in the atmosphere of death to America and death to Israel. And Ghalibaf has been part of that world. But at the same time, he is also kind of the figure who can suddenly appear in negotiations, back-channel discussions, and strategic bargaining when the regime needs to shift tone. That contradiction is not a personal quirk. It is the Islamic Republic in human form. Loud on a stage, flexible behind closed doors. Ideological in public, transactional in practice. And Ghalibaf knows how to wear both masks. He is not a pure ideologue. He is not a true believer in the romantic sense. He is something more useful to the regime, a professional survivor. When hardline rhetoric is needed, he can stand in that space. When pragmatism is needed, he can look like a practical operator. When management is needed, he can play the executive. When force is needed, his background speaks for itself. And that is exactly what makes men like him dangerous. There is another layer to Ghalibaf that should not be ignored. His relationship to the military infrastructure of the regime, especially its missile identity. In this video, Amir Ali Hajizadeh credits Ghalibaf as an important reason Iran developed its missile strength, and that is important.
امروز موشکی به اینجا رسیده، کسای زیادی زحمت کشیدن، تلاش کردن، نماد اونها شهید تهرانی مقدمه. ولی من امروز باید این رو عرض بکنم که کسی که باعث شد موشکی تا این حد گسترش پیدا بکنه و نام اون هیچ جا برده نشد و همچنان گمنامه و امروز با آزادی عمل ما دیگه میتونیم اون رو مطرح بکنیم، آقای دکتر غالیبافه. دوره‌ای که ایشون فرمانده ما بودن باعث شدن که بنیانی گذاشته بشه تا امروز در هر شهر و شهرستان و استان یک پایگاه داشته باشیم.
Even without building an entire case around that one clip, the broader point still matters. Ghalibaf is not just a political administrator who drifted away from the hard security world. He comes from it. And if men inside the IRGC speak about him in relation to missile infrastructure or strategic military development, that reinforces something crucial about his image. He is seen, at least by part of the regime, not as a civilian politician who happened to pass through military institutions, but as someone whose roots remain tied to the hard architecture of the state power. That matters because it changes how people should view him. He is not just another parliamentarian. He is a man whose political identity still carries the shadow of the IRGC. And in the Islamic Republic, that shadow is never just symbolic. It is a source of power, fear, leverage, and legitimacy inside the system. Now we get to the present. Why talk about Ghalibaf now? Because this is exactly the kind of moment when men like him become more important. Khamenei is dead, the regime has been damaged, major figures have been removed, war has exposed weaknesses, the structure is unstable. And in unstable systems, you often see certain types rise forward. Not because they are loved, not because they are legitimate, but because they combine violence, institutional experience, insider access, and hunger for power. That is the environment in which Ghalibaf becomes more relevant. He can present himself outwardly as a negotiator, as a stabilizer, as a political figure, and inwardly to the regime, he can present himself as a man who understands force, understands hierarchy, understands survival, and he can help keep the system together. That is why people are watching him closely now. Not because he is new, but because this moment may finally suit the kind of man who has always been. He's not important because of a title alone. He's important because this kind of crisis rewards the exact type of figure he represents. This is where we need to be completely clear. Ghalibaf should not be viewed as some practical reformist or some transitional technocrat who somehow stands apart from the worst part of the Islamic Republic. That would be a serious mistake. His record points in the opposite direction. He comes out of the IRGC. He is tied to the repression of 1999. He rose through the security and political apparatus. He carries the shadow of corruption scandals. He was close to Khamenei. He has been used in major positions across the system. And now, in one of the regime's most fragile moments, he is once again near the center. So if anyone tries to repackage him as a manager, a pragmatist, or a serious statesman, the right question is simple. Manager of what? Pragmatic for whom? Serious in service of what? Because Ghalibaf does not represent the break from the Islamic Republic. He represents one of its most complete forms, a polished version of the same system, a disciplined version of the same machinery, a more presentable face for the same structure of coercion, patronage, and control. Muhammad Baqir Ghalibaf should not be understood through his current title alone. He is not just the Speaker of the Parliament. He is not just a negotiator. He is not just a former mayor. He is one of the regime's real faces. A man came out of the Revolutionary Guards, proved himself in the world of repression, climbed through the structure of power, carried the smell of corruption, stayed close to Khamenei, and has now re-emerged in one of the most dangerous and uncertain moments in the history of the Islamic Republic. My reading is straightforward. Ghalibaf is not the kind of man who simply wants to survive. He is the kind of man who wants to rise higher and higher. And in a moment when the top of the pyramid has fractured, it is only natural to look at him and ask whether he sees this as his chance to become one of the main heirs to power inside the wounded regime. That part is analysis and opinion, but is not baseless. Because when you line up the full record, repression, ambition, military roots, political reinvention, closeness to power, corruption, and survival, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Ghalibaf is not just an individual. He is a governing logic. Repression in the street, patronage in power, slogans on the stage, deals behind closed doors, and an endless hunger to climb. That is why understanding him matters. Because if the Islamic Republic even tries to sell one of these men again under the language of stability, management, pragmatism, or transition, people need to know what is actually hiding behind the face. Ghalibaf should be judged by his record, not by his suit. And his record is not the record of an ordinary politician. It is the record of a hard security man, close to power, marked by scandal, shaped by repression, and driven by ambition. And that is exactly why he should never be underestimated.